Catholic Martyrs of the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, A Catholic Holocaust, by Fray Justo Perez de Urbel. Chapter 20, Double Shining Crown. We are going to describe now an event for which no adjectives suffice. If it were not a matter of duty to relate it, we would ask the Lord, through His divine mercy, to erase the whole matter from our memory. We will let the story unfold as simply and succinctly as possible. Then the reader can judge for himself. Mariana Estévez Juncia was 23 years old. She was a member of Catholic Action. Her hometown was Murcia. That was where she spent her childhood. Later on, she and her parents moved to Malaga, where they encountered the Red Massacre. One can learn about what sort of girl Mariana was just by hearing how she died. We will say, nevertheless, that she dedicated her body to Our Lady, making purity the keynote of her life. And on that basis were built many virtues that made an admirable woman of Mariana. When the Red Rule burst into Malaga, the girl and her parents took refuge on the outskirts of the city. They stayed in the house of a doctor, a friend of theirs, who, because of the useful services he could and did perform for the Reds, was well treated by them. Nobody troubled them at all during this time. All was relatively quiet. Then the searches began. For various reasons that it is not necessary to go into now, they began to suspect the doctor, principally because of his fascist past, as they put it. After this, there was no more peace anymore. Both the doctor and Mariana's parents had the same fear, that the girl might fall into the hands of the monsters. So they did all in their power to hide her. But under the threat of the searches, neither the girl nor the others could consider themselves safe. They arranged to flee to nationalist territory, where they could find order and tranquility. The doctor owned a small car that the militia had wanted to requisition at one time, but the doctor pointed out that it was absolutely necessary to him, as it was the only means by which he could reach places where he was needed and prevent many people from dying. He convinced them, and they did not take the vehicle. So the doctor and the others prepared to flee in that small vehicle. They put their trust in Providence, and one day, early in the morning, set off. The doctor was at the wheel, and the others curled up in the back. They passed several guard posts. There were anxious moments when they were questioned by the sentries. "Where are you going with this car?" "To carry out my duty," replied the doctor. "It would be best if you did not hold me up too long." And he showed his Red Doctor's identity card. "Where are the wounded?" "Where are the wounded? You ask me in wartime, where are the wounded? I prefer not to answer you." The doctor, accustomed to dealing with those people, being altogether superior to them, knew how to manipulate them. The special kind of severity that he used in dealing with sentries always worked well. Due to that firmness, he passed many guard posts. Eventually, they found themselves traveling along the main road. This was more or less the field of battle. Another 10 miles, and they would come up against the first nationalist outposts and safety. The highway seemed lonely, dark, with the first light of morning picking out the sylvan masses on one side and surreal phantoms on the other. Everyone stayed silent. "A little more," said the doctor to cheer up the passengers, "and we'll definitely be safe." "God willing," said Mariana. Then they began to pray the Holy Rosary. A few more miles, and they saw that, in the opposite direction to that in which they were traveling, a truck was coming towards them. There was nothing to do but keep going, keep pressing on. There were agonizing moments. Both the car and the truck drew closer. Everything was in the balance. Death and salvation were playing a tremendous game of chance. The girl shouted out, "God's will be done!" Still the two vehicles drew closer. With 200 yards to go, the truck spun around and blocked the highway. The car had to stop. Several armed men got out of the truck. All was lost. The dress and the demeanor of those men was only too meaningful to the fugitives. They came closer. "Where are you going?" The doctor replied, "Is that the way to address a man of the people?" The militia who had spoken was somewhat taken aback. Then he said, "Greetings, comrade." "Greetings," said the doctor, whose name was Martin Campos. He had spoken smiling as if he were in his own house rather than dicing with death. "Where are you going?" replied the militia. Don Martin showed his identity card as a doctor attached to the Red Army. "With your permission, comrade." And he took the identity card and went over to his companions, who were talking and laughing some yards distant from the car. Then they all came back together. "This is all right, but where are you going? Who are these people?" Don Martin gave his explanations. He could not convince them. His services were not needed along this road, and as it was dangerous to proceed further on account of the proximity of the enemy lines, it would be better if he went back with them. The doctor pulled out all the stops he could think of. "So, the fascists are that close. So we were going straight into the wolf's mouth. Nobody around here knew anything about it. We'll come back with you." The militia seemed to be convinced, but then one of them said, "What about the others? Are they doctors as well?" It was a very tricky complication. The doctor said afterwards that he could not understand how this detail had not been looked into before. "No," said Don Martin. "Of course they're not doctors. They're family. I often have as many as 40 wounded to look after, and obviously I could not look after all of them at once. My family helps me. I think it's the best I can do for the revolution. Don't you agree?" Once again, they seemed to have been convinced. The two vehicles backed off. One of the militia, the one who had spoken first and appeared to be the leader, got into the car, as he said, "For greater security." But then the same militia discovered the rosary that Mariana had been holding in her hands. It had rolled onto the floor, and she was trying to hide it with her foot. Now the game was definitely up. They had to stop the car. The militia came back and pushed them all into the truck. In Malaga, all was revealed. Mariana's father was shot the same day, and his wife and daughter were shut up in a cellar. At this point, we will leave Don Martin, who after a fairly rough time managed to escape, and to him we owe the first part of this story. The martyrdom of Mariana and her mother began. It was a long and bloody martyrdom, a spine-chilling martyrdom. In the mornings, the militia entered the cellar and proceeded to amuse themselves at the expense of the two women in the most shameful and disgusting manner that it is possible to imagine. In their presence, they performed all sorts of obscene acts, laughing, drinking themselves silly, and turning into monsters of diabolical violence. With the rosy that they had brought along from the car, they committed the most grotesque sacrileges and abuses. They wound it round the neck of each one of them and tightened it up until they were nearly asphyxiated. On one occasion, Mariana's mother fainted. Another day, a drunken militia tortured them for 2 hours, sticking pins in all over their bodies. They ended up covered in blood. One morning, 2 weeks later, they took them out of the prison and put them into the same car that they had tried to escape in. Don Martin's car had remained with them. They were taken out of the city by the same road by which they had attempted to escape. They stopped the car and made them get out. Then they followed a path leading off from the side of the road until they reached a clearing in the middle of a pine wood. They took Mariana's clothes off, although she defended herself ferociously. And they raped her, those monsters, in the presence of her mother. And then they killed both of them. And so that wonderful girl won the double crown of virgin and martyr that will never be taken away from her.